The advertisement had been pinned to the notice board outside the postal counter in Battleford for 3 weeks before she pulled the tack from the corner and took it down. It was not a long notice. The man who had written it used a hand that did not waste ink. He needed someone to cook and keep the house at a stopping place on the Carlton Trail, 18 miles southeast of town. The work would be steady, room and board provided. If the arrangement suited both parties, they could speak to a justice of the peace before the cold came in. He had written that last part as a single spare sentence, with no elaboration on either side of it, and left the rest to her. She read it twice standing at the postal counter, then folded it into the pocket of her coat. She had come to Battleford the previous March, arriving on the train from Winnipeg with a trunk that was half empty and a set of good kitchen knives that had belonged to her mother. Her husband had died in January of a lung sickness that had taken 3 weeks to do what it intended from the very first day. She was 29 years old. She had spent 6 months taking in sewing and alterations from a room above the dry goods store on Railway Avenue. And she had become very good at knowing the difference between what a situation offered and what it was going to cost. She did not answer the advertisement that day. She put it in her pocket and went back to her room and sat at the window for a long time, watching the supply wagons turn off Main Street toward the rail yard. She had not expected to answer it at all. She had told herself she was only curious about the wording. She wrote back the following morning. A week later, she arrived at the stopping house on the back of a freight wagon heading south. The driver let her down at the gate without ceremony. She stood in the road with her trunk and looked at the place. It was a low timber building, longer than it was wide, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. A barn stood 30 yards to the east, and beyond it a root cellar with a sod roof beginning to go patchy in the August heat. The yard was clean, which she noted. Not swept clean, but free of the accumulated wreckage that collects when a man has stopped expecting things to improve. The fence posts along the road were straight, and the wire was tight. Somebody had been maintaining the outward appearance of the place, even while the inside life of it had narrowed considerably. She could see the Carlton Trail from where she stood, running northwest toward Fort Carlton and southeast toward the railway junction. It was August, and the road surface was pale and hard as old bone, and there were no fresh wagon tracks in the dust. She understood something about the problem before she had taken 20 steps toward the door. He came around from the back of the building when he heard the freight wagon leave. He stopped when he saw her, looking at her in the way of a man who has been expecting something and has not let himself picture it too clearly. He was perhaps 40 or perhaps a few years younger. The sun made those numbers difficult to count. He had a weather-dark face and careful hands, and he did not say anything immediately, which she appreciated. She had met too many people since her husband died who filled silence, like it was a wound they needed to cover over. He said, "You answered the notice." She said, "I did." He looked at her trunk, then at her. He said, "I'll carry that." She said, "I can manage it." She took one handle and tipped the trunk onto its corner, and he took the other end without argument, and they brought it up the porch steps between them. The room he showed her was off the kitchen, small, a window that faced east, a rope bed with a tick mattress, a nail in the wall, and a curtain that someone had hemmed carefully on 3 sides. She counted the curtain as more than she had expected. She unpacked in the order she always did. Practical things first, her extra dress, her thread case. Her knives went on the windowsill. She had learned years ago not to leave anything necessary at the bottom of a bag. When she came back out to the kitchen, she found him at the table with a ledger open, writing in it without looking up. A woman was working at the sideboard, her back to the room, pressing pie dough with the flat authority of someone who did not need an audience. She was perhaps 60, with gray-streaked hair pinned back neatly, and a way of holding her shoulders that said she had been doing hard work since before anyone else in the room could remember. He said, without raising his head, "That's Josette. She comes Mondays for the laundry and baking." Josette turned and looked at her without expression, and then turned back to the dough, not unfriendly, only economical. She found the stove cold and the wood box low and a pot of salt pork soaking in a basin that had been at it long enough to need refreshing. She changed the water without asking, set it back, went to the lean to off the back for wood, and built the fire. He looked up once from the ledger and back down. By the time supper was on the table, Josette had gone home down the road toward the Métis settlement, taking 2 of the fresh pies with her and leaving 2 behind, which said something considered about the woman. He ate without comment, but he ate well, and when he carried his own bowl to the basin afterward, she filed that too, as she filed most things. Quietly, without attaching more to it than it was. He was hungry, the food was adequate, he had manners, those were facts. In the morning she woke an hour before the light changed and dressed in the dark, and went out to walk the property while he was still in the bunkhouse. The barn held 4 working horses, sound and well kept, and 2 milk cows and a pen of chickens that needed mucking. She left the chickens for now. She was looking at the land. The stopping house sat in a wide, shallow bowl between 2 rises. The kind of country the Northwest Territories made without effort. Pale grass running thin to the horizon in every direction. She had looked at the survey map at the Battleford post office before she left. She knew the creek ran somewhere north of the property line. She went to find it. It was not much to speak of. A low channel, 3 feet across, running slow and clear over a bed of rounded gray stone. She crouched and put her hand in. Cold. In the way that spring-fed water stays cold through August when snowmelt water does not. She pressed her thumb into the gravel at the bottom and felt the give of it, the kind of give. That means the water table is near and stable, not seasonal, not borrowed from somewhere upstream. She stood and looked south toward the property line, toward where the field ran dry and pale between the creek and the fence. The soil there was a different color than the rest, darker. She went to it and pressed the toe of her boot into the surface and felt how it yielded differently than the clay of the trail's side. She crouched and worked 2 fingers into the earth. It came up dark and slightly damp even in August. It smelled of something alive. She had grown up in the Ottawa Valley, on a homestead where her father had spent 20 years arguing with clay soil and winning, slowly, by redirecting drainage from the upper fields. She had watched him redirect water, the way some people redirect arguments, not by confronting it directly, but by changing the conditions around it. She understood what she was looking at here. She filed it the way she filed the curtain, the fence posts, the railway water tower she had seen on the far horizon coming in on the freight wagon. She filed it and said nothing yet. At breakfast she said, "How many travelers through in a week?" He said 4, maybe 6, used to be 30-35 on a good week. She said, "Since the railway went in." He said, "Since the railway went in." He said it with the flatness of a man who has been repeating a true thing long enough that it no longer surprises him to say it out loud. She said, "What's the land north of the creek used for?" He looked at her across the table. He said, "It's part of the quarter section. It's never been broken." She said, "Has it been tried?" He said, "Not by me. There was Timothy coming up wild along the creek bank when I first came here. Didn't seem worth the trouble of cutting." She looked at her cup. She said, "Is the railway depot at Langham still tendering supply contracts?" He put down his cup. She said, "There was an announcement in the Battleford paper in March. They were looking for local hay suppliers to cut their freighting costs from Manitoba. I don't know if the tender's still open." He was quiet for a long moment. She did not fill it. She had learned which silences were thinking and which were something else, and this was thinking. He said, "The creek doesn't reach the lower field." She said, "Not presently." Josette came the following Monday as always, and she watched the new woman the way she had watched everyone who came through this stopping house in the 15 years she had been walking down this road on Monday mornings, carefully and without announcing what she saw. By the second Monday she had formed a judgment. By the third she offered it, which was not her habit with most people. She said, while they were sorting the laundry in the yard, "You're thinking about the land by the creek." She looked up from the pile she was sorting. She said, "How did you know?" Josette said, "You walk out there every morning before the fire's built. You crouch in the same spot for a while before you come back." She shook out a shirt and held it to the light to check the seam. My grandfather ran cattle on that piece of ground before the trail existed. He always said the grass there had a particular quality. It came back harder after the dry years, fuller than it had any right. She said, "Has anyone ever channeled the water toward the lower field?" Josette set the shirt in the pile. She said, "Not in my memory. But there's low place in these banks, about 40 yards upstream, soft ground. Old channel, maybe, from when the creek ran differently. The horsetail grows thick there even in August." She looked toward the north without meaning to. She said, "Can you show me?" Josette showed her. The low place in the bank was exactly as described. A softening in the earth 4 feet wide, where the ground dropped in a gentle incline and the vegetation changed from dry grass to sedge and horsetail, green and thick, where everything around it had gone yellow with the dry month. She pressed both palms flat into the earth. It yielded like something waiting. She stood and looked south toward the lower field. 60 yards of dry ground between the bank and the fence line, running on a grade so slight you would not notice it walking across, but that she had been calculating in her body every morning for 3 weeks. The grade was there. It was usable. She heard him behind her. He had followed at a distance in the way he did when she went somewhere he hadn't expected. She said, without turning, "If we cut through the bank at this point and lined the channel with stone, the water would reach the lower field before September." He came up beside her. He looked at the bank and then at the field. She said, "Timothy seeds in September if the ground has moisture. It roots over winter. By May, it's ready to cut." He said, "That's a 10-day job at least." She said, 10 days if the bank is soft all the way through. I think it is." He looked at the low place in the bank. He looked at the dry field. He said quietly, "I have spades." They began the following morning at first light. She had been right about the bank. It was soft for 3 feet down, years of seasonal wet, having done the preliminary work long before they arrived to finish it. He cut the first section, the top crust of compressed earth and root, while she pulled the material back and sorted it for the channel sides. They did not speak much. The work made its own kind of conversation. Josette arrived on Wednesday that week, not Monday. She brought her eldest grandson, Sylvan, a boy of 14, and she set him to carrying stone from the creek bed to line the channel without explaining herself or waiting to be thanked for the thought. He worked without complaint and stacked the stone precisely where she pointed. On the 4th morning, they struck the old channel. The spade went in with a different sound, hollow rather than flat, and then water seeped up around the blade, slow and dark, the color of weak tea, and then clearing as they watched it. She stepped back from the edge. He stepped back from the other side. Neither of them said anything. By the time the light started dropping that evening, the channel was open enough to show real movement. The water found the incline and started south, and she watched it cross the field with a feeling she had not had in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something more structural than that. The feeling of a thing that was supposed to be in motion, finally moving. He stood with the spade resting against his shoulder and watched the water go. He said, "The near corner's going to be too wet." She said, "We raised the near corner with the spoil from the bank. I want the water further south in any case, near the fence line, where the grade is better." He looked at her. He said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Tomorrow." Josette's grandson, Sylvain, became a regular presence through the rest of August and into September. He had a good eye for where stone wanted to sit and the patience for fine work that she had not expected from a boy his age. By the 3rd, Josette felt herself staying for supper, and by the 4th it was simply understood that she would, without anyone deciding it formally. One evening Josette said, "My husband used to say this piece of land was waiting for someone to ask it the right question." She was at the stove. She said, "What question?" Josette said, "He never said exactly. He was the kind of man who thought the question was the point, not what you asked it about." She stood with the spoon in her hand for a moment. She said, "That sounds like it would get old." Josette said, "Sometimes, mostly it was useful." She folded her hands on the table and looked at her. "He would have liked watching you work." She did not know what to do with that. She turned back to the stove. Timothy seed arrived from Battleford in late September. She had seeded half the lower field by hand before the first frost came, working in the early mornings when the ground still held the night's moisture. He finished the other half without being asked and without commenting on what they were doing, which she had come to understand was his particular way of committing to something. He did not announce. He simply showed up and did the work. The frost arrived on an October night, the temperature dropping fast after a clear sky in the way prairie cold does, with very little warning beyond the quality of the last light at dusk. She had brought the remaining seed bags inside before dark. She had learned over the summer how to read the sky the way her father had taught her to read soil, with the body first before the mind caught up. She lay in the small room off the kitchen that night, listening to the frost tighten the timbers around her, and turned something over that she had been not turning over all summer, that she had stopped counting the days. In Battleford, she had counted them, the way you count when the present situation is a waiting room for the next one. She was not counting now. She was not waiting for anything. She held that thought in the dark for a while, the way she had held the damp soil in her hands when she first found it, feeling what was behind it and what it meant. She did not name it. She put it away carefully and went to sleep. The railway agent's letter arrived in February. She read it twice at the postal counter in Battleford. She had come in with him for the monthly supplies and handed it across without comment. The tender for the 1888 season was open. The depot at Langham was accepting supply applications from local producers. Timothy Hay preferred. Delivery terms and rates were laid out clearly on the second page, and the rates were fair. He read it and folded it along its creases and put it in his coat pocket. She watched him without appearing to. He said, "I'll need the figures before I can write back." She said, "I have them." He looked at her. She said, "I've been keeping the calculations since October. Estimated yield per acre, going rates for this district, transport cost using your team. I can show you tonight." He said, "Show me tonight." They drove back on a road that was frozen hard and clean, the horses moving steady in the cold. She kept her hands in her lap and watched the sky to the northwest, where a gray line of cloud was building flat along the horizon. She said there would be snow by Thursday. He said he knew. She said the first cutting would need to be in the loft before Wednesday. He said they would do it tomorrow. They did. Sylvain came with his uncle Rémi, a broad, quiet man who worked without needing to talk about it. And the four of them had the first cut of Timothy into the loft before noon. She stood in the loft, watching the bales come up through the hatch, and counted them, and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the numbers and everything to do with having seen, in September, what the field was going to become, and then watching it become exactly that. That evening, she laid the accounts open on the kitchen table. He sat across and read through them the way he did everything, without hurrying. He asked 2 questions. She answered both. He nodded once, and she saw in his face the particular expression she had seen 6 or 7 times over the past months, when something settled into place that had been loose without him quite knowing it. He said, "Write the answer tonight." She said, "I have it drafted." He read it through. He said, "Change the last sentence. It's too hesitant." She changed it. He signed his name at the bottom and slid the page across, and she signed hers beneath his. And they looked at the 2 names together for a moment, and then he got up and put the coffee pot on the stove. Josette arrived in April and did not leave. She did not announce this decision. She arrived one morning with a bundle under her arm and reorganized the root cellar in the manner of a person who expects to use it again come autumn. By May, it was simply understood that she would stay on through the season to manage the preserving and the dairy, and that Sylvain would come for the hay work, and that Rémi would handle the heavy hauling. Nobody formally agreed to any of this. It arranged itself the way things arrange themselves when the people involved have stopped pretending they need to negotiate what is already obvious. The stopping house was not what it had been. It was something different now, something quieter and more particular. Travelers still came through, fewer, but they stayed longer because the meals were better and the beds were properly aired, and there was good hay for the horses and cold water from a cellar stocked through the whole dark winter. She had started a kitchen garden against the south wall in early May, working the bed herself in the mornings, and by July it was producing things that had not appeared on that table before. The railway contract for the first year came to more than the stopping house had made in the 2 years before she arrived. She did not say this aloud. She wrote it in the ledger in her steady hand and set it in its place on the shelf. He found it there eventually, read it, put it back without comment. In July, a man came out from the Prince Albert newspaper to write a short piece about small local operations supplying the railway. He spoke mostly with him and briefly with her, and he got the acreage figures approximately right. He spelled Josette's name wrong and did not mention Sylvain or Rémi at all. She corrected Josette's name in the margin of the clipping with a pencil. Josette folded it into her apron pocket without saying anything. But the way she moved through the kitchen that afternoon was different, lighter. She noticed. And she did not say anything about noticing, and Josette did not say anything about it either, and that was its own kind of conversation. There was an evening in August when she was at the table with the account books, and he came in from the field and set something on the open page before he went to the basin to wash. She looked at it. A piece of flint, smooth, gray-blue, the kind the creek gravel turned up after a hard rain. Not quite a gift. Something he had carried in without deciding too clearly why he was carrying it. She left it where he had put it. He built the second chair through the evenings of late August, working at the sawhorses in the yard in the last of the light. She watched it take from the kitchen window without appearing to watch. One morning in the final week of the month, it appeared on the porch beside the first one, facing east, toward the field and the creek and the long pale grass stretching out beyond. She sat in it that evening after the dishes were done. He came out and sat in the other. From inside came Josette's voice, low and unhurried, saying something to Sylvain in the mixture of French and Cree she used when she was at ease, the sound of it threaded through the ordinary sounds of the evening. The hayfield held the last of the light a moment longer than the sky did, that deep August gold that does not last and does not try to. She kept her hands folded in her lap. The grass moved the way it does when there is no particular wind, only the breathing of that flat, enormous country, steady and indifferent and very large. They stayed until the light was gone.